Hi everyone, this is Jim. Welcome to episode 33 of Opening Basics. We're going to continue our look at the Dutch defense, which is d4 f5. And in this video we're going to look at the Classical and the Stonewall Dutch. So let's put these on the board. So after f5, g3 is the most common move. Then the Classical and the Stonewall have this move e6 in common, so e6 is a way to get to both of them. And c4, knight f6. Very similar to the Leningrad, but the bishop is going to e7 or d6 rather than coming out to the g file here. Bishop to g2. And now, let's see, let's go with the Classical Dutch first. The Classical Dutch is bishop to e7, knight to f3, and then both sides castle. And then the move d6 here. So this is a Classical Dutch. A Stonewall can be reached with the move d5 here. But it's a version of the Stonewall with the bishop on e7, which we will talk about a little later in this video. But this d6 move sets up a very interesting position where Black has got control over these squares around the center and on his side of the board. He's delayed his development of the queenside pieces, but this position is kind of closed, and the development is going to proceed very slowly. And these pawns are going to gradually push forward. And I have a game to illustrate some of these principles. So let's go back to the game. I just diverged a little bit to show you the normal moves and the normal way that you get to this position. The game I wanted to look at is Botvinnik versus Bronstein. This was played in their World Championship match. This was the first game of the match. And Bronstein, with the black pieces, chose not the immediate f5, but to prepare f5 with the move e6. And you'll see this quite a bit even today. And one idea of this move order is that it prevents the Staunton gambit. So if you wanted to just avoid the Staunton gambit, you want to play the Dutch, but you don't want to deal with that gambit line, then you can play with e6. But when you play this way, you have to be prepared to face the move e4. And that would just transpose. Actually, e4 is the main move here. And what you've got is a French defense. So you have to be willing to play the French defense if you start with e6. But if you know both the French defense and the Dutch defense, this is an interesting way to play, and it gives you kind of a complete repertoire against both e4 and d4. Anyway, so e6 is the way it was played, and Botvinnik went with c4, so we get into the Dutch after f5. This is how the game went. And now Botvinnik continued with g3, and we'll get this similar kind of setup. We're going to get a classical Dutch here. So let's just go through the moves. Just wanted to point out that little move order trick. And here's another one. Botvinnik doesn't go with the routine knight f3, but has a different idea for arranging his knights. Black castles, and white plays e3. And we get d6. So again, we get this classical setup here with black controlling all of these pawns, all these squares in front of the pawns, and preparing to slowly build up on the king side. And now we see Botvinnik's idea, which is to bring the knight out to e2 instead of bringing it to f3. So let's play on a few moves, just to give you a flavor of the game. Let's see, Bronstein pushed on with c6, castles, e5. So this slow build-up of the pawns, they're gradually creeping forward. When this e5 move is made, now suddenly this bishop starts to have a little more scope. And notice that with the closed nature of the position, Bronstein doesn't feel it necessary to really develop all his pieces. And let's see, let's go forward. We get a couple more moves. Queen e8 is another one I wanted to point out. Putting the queen on a light square and preparing to come out on the king side, a very common feature of a lot of the Dutch defense setups. You just need to maneuver your pieces around and get them on good squares. You're sort of working around this kind of blocked up center. So let's go forward a little bit. There was that exchange. Notice how the light squared bishop came to life as a result of that pawn push. And that's one of the points of this advanced f-pawn, is that either it will either trade itself off for the e-pawn here, or sometimes it'll push forward and trade itself off for the g-pawn. In this case, white went ahead and took first, but it's opened up the f-file, and black has some ideas along that file. So the game continued, and now we get, as with a lot of Dutch defense positions, a lot of maneuvering. The pieces go back and forth. This bishop goes from one side of the board to the other, and this bishop gets kicked around a little bit. The result of this game was a draw, but there was actually right here, there was actually an opportunity for black to play in a more enterprising fashion. Maybe this being the first game of the World Championship match, the two sides feeling each other out, maybe they were content with the draw. But this is a position where this pawn is kind of under fire, and Bronstein could have gone for this weird line with an unusual material balance by taking that pawn. And then after a long series of trades, rook takes, knight takes, rook takes again. Notice, by the way, that there's all these pins operating. This knight is kind of pinned against that rook, and it's also defending this knight, which is under attack from that bishop. So really, the rooks are really the only pieces that are free to take back on d5. But there's one more defender than there is attacker there. So at the end, white has an extra piece in a way. There's 4 pieces against 3, but it's actually 2 rooks and 1 minor piece against 4 pieces. So you could think of it as 3 minor pieces for 2 rooks, and black gained 1 a pawn. But white's pieces are pretty active. Anyway, this would have been an interesting way to play. Maybe there's a slight advantage to black here, but maybe it'd be too difficult to really realize it. Anyway, the game petered out into a draw after a few more moves, but there was a trade there, and then a repetition with the knight jumping back and forth and kicking the rook. But I just wanted to introduce that as the classical line, kind of a slow way of playing the Dutch, where you gradually build up the center with pawns on c6, first d6 and then later c6, and then pushing on with e5, building up the center that way. It's one way to play with the Dutch. Okay, let's look at another example here. This is we're going to stick with this championship match between Botvinnik and Bronstein. It's interesting because Botvinnik played the Dutch defense as well, so Bronstein was sort of challenging him on his own territory, and so this was the last time these positions were really debated at a high level. The Dutch defense sort of fell out of popularity after this, but these guys staked out some pretty interesting ground with it. This is another example of how to get into the Dutch defense from a different move order. Botvinnik with the white pieces, Bronstein with the black pieces. And we get a queen's pawn game where after the move g3, then black can play f5 here, and we get the classical Dutch defense setup. And now this is a stonewall. And this is a stonewall with the bishop on e7, which is one of the major ways of playing it. And in fact, the same position comes from a different move order more commonly. So if we go back and do the move order trick again, after d4, black replies f5, and g3, knight f6, most common moves, bishop g2, and now e6. Not the most common, but the second choice in the way to get to the classical and the stonewall. c4, c6 here could be played, but we're going classical lines, bishop e7, knight f3, castles. I forget whether they had castled or not. Well, let's throw on the castles, and d5. And we get the position that we saw in the game, but just by a different move order. And let's see, if they hadn't castled yet, then that, let's see, we can check that out. Oh, no, they had castled. So, yeah, it's exactly the same position. And we'll see one of the weaknesses of this bishop on e7 here. Botvinnik, who's a positional style player in a lot of respects, starts to target that bishop with this move b3. And this is still the main plan today against this position. black castles, and the bishop goes to a3. And there's no good way to, well, that bishop has no squares, so there's no way to avoid the trade. And in this game, it's went on, and Botvinnik got a pretty decent position out of it. Black is not necessarily worse here. Let's see. He put the bishop to b7, which is a very common deployment. But there are other ideas. If you have time, you can bring the bishop around like this and activate it on the king side is another plan for dealing with that bishop. But that's something, if you're playing the Dutch defense, you have to figure out a way to solve the problem of the light-squared bishop, if you're playing particularly the Stonewall. And you're not afraid of putting the bishop here and having him trade off, because it's not such a great piece, and you might want to get rid of this knight that's sitting on a good square. So it is one of the issues with the Stonewall that you've left a hole in your structure here on d5, and white is going to try and occupy that. So let's see how this plays out. Bronstein goes with the bishop b7. Botvinnik gets his other knight into the game, and then we see a bunch of trades because Bronstein didn't want to concede to have a knight on d5 for everyone to get rid of it. So he was piling up pressure there, and eventually Botvinnik traded it off. And now, once again, black is slowly expanding and liberating his bishops. And what happens in this case is the bishops actually get traded. So we get into a position with just queens, pawns, and knights. And this is completely equal. So it's a success for black, you might say, particularly at this level. Bronstein gets into a bit of trouble later. He actually loses this game, but I just want to go on and show one critical moment here. Right here, and also because this is a typical idea with the Dutch defense, you want to push this pawn forward sometime to loosen up white's position and get a little counterplay. And let's see, we're on move 31 here, so we're getting near the time control. Maybe Bronstein thought this would be a good time to try and complicate things, put a little pressure on his opponent. So he pushes out with f4, and then he follows it up with knight h5. And the interesting thing is that this gets black in a little bit of trouble, and eventually white gets a better endgame and goes on to win it. But this could have been played in a slightly different move order. Bronstein could have thrown in rook takes c2 first. And after rook takes c2, rook takes, then play knight h5. And the queen comes over here to defend the pawn, then trade off, and grab here with check. And this turns out to be an equal position, so he'd have no trouble here. But like I said, he was probably trying to complicate things and maybe get his opponent in a little bit of trouble. But Botvinnik navigated the complications in the game and came out ahead in a long endgame. So that's another example of the Stonewall. Here, let's go on to the next one. And then this is a third kind of setup with the Stonewall. This is from game 12 of the Botvinnik-Bronstein match. It's this time Botvinnik has the black pieces. He's playing the Stonewall. And we get to it via this e6 move order again. Bronstein is happy to play against the Dutch, and Botvinnik wants to play it. Now in this game, Bronstein goes for a bit of an unusual setup, maybe wanting to avoid the main lines in case his opponent has some special preparation there. But we get a similar kind of position. Let's see, he goes out here with a knight. Also, I think it's good to show some of the other setups that can be tried, and particularly this knight h3 for white is an interesting idea instead of the routine knight f3 and pawn to g3, which is what all the other games have featured. Well, there was one knight e2, but knight f3 and g3 and bishop g2 are the main moves, a main setup here on the king side. But the knight can come here, stopping the g-pawn from coming forward, and the knight might also land on this f4 square. It might be an interesting spot to go to put some pressure on the e-pawn. So this knight h3 is an interesting idea. Now c6 and bishop d2, and Botvinnik completes the Stonewall setup with bishop to d6. And when the bishop comes out here, this is more like the modern Stonewall. And I'll show one example of the modern Stonewall at the end of this. And it's more like the way it's played today. And you'll see the advantage of putting the bishop here in a minute. This queen goes to c2. Let's see, black castles. White castles queenside. So this is an unusual setup from Bronstein going for this queenside castling. But now black plays queen e7. And the idea is that, even in the case if white had played b3 and bishop a3, which is not happening in this game because of the way that the Bronstein had played it, the queen and the bishop are exerting a lot of force along this diagonal, and this bishop doesn't so easily get traded off. Now, the way this game continues, Bronstein decides to push on with his pawns and bust up the center. And this is one way that you can actually win. You set up, as black, you set up this really strong defensive barrier here, and you just kind of cancel that. Just kind of sit back and wait and see if your opponent can break through here and maybe encourage them to overextend. And let's see, after a few trades, instead of taking back right away, Bronstein with the white pieces is pushing on with e4, and we get this kind of situation where knight takes e4 is played, and b5. So black is holding on to the extra pawn here, and we get this complicated game. Let's see, he does end up losing that dark squared bishop, but he got a good knight for it, so that was a reasonable trade from black's point of view, and that f4 was played here. And I don't know if I want to go through the rest of this game. It does go into an endgame where white's a little bit better, and even though I think black eventually gets the pawn back, but white has the better of that endgame. So let's look at one more game. I wanted to show the modern Stonewall. I guess once again I'll go put the moves on the board in the most common order. It's d4, f5, g3, knight to f6, bishop to g2, and now e6 here, going for the either the classical or the Stonewall. You really haven't committed at the point you play here. c4, and now c6. This is going for the modern Stonewall. If you're going for the classical and you didn't mind, or a Stonewall with bishop on e7, you can play bishop e7 right here. But c6 is the most common way to prepare d5, and after knight f3, d5 is played here, castles, and bishop d6, b3, preparing bishop to a3 as we saw in the other game, and now queen to e7 here. So the bishop goes to b2, and black can castle here, or there are other moves, but typical setup for the modern Stonewall. And in this position, black is going to try and keep that bishop, not trade it off so easily. And there's still some maneuvering that needs to be done to bring the rest of the pieces into the game. And in the meantime, I think white's plan is pretty straightforward. This knight comes here, this knight comes to the key central location, and then this knight can come over to back it up. So interesting game can ensue from here. I had one more example. Let's go back to the game. I just diverged there to show the move order because this is another game where e6 was played instead. But we very quickly get back to the main line after c4, f5, g3. Back to the position we just saw earlier. Knight f6, bishop g2, and c6, going for the modern Stonewall. This game was played in 1990, and with the white pieces we have Luc von Wely, and with the black pieces we have Vladimir Kramnick. So this was played in the European Under-20 Championship in 1990. So it shows the modern handling of the position. Knight comes out to f3, d5, castles, bishop d6, b3, all the same moves we saw before. Queen e7, bishop b2, and he didn't castle here, he played b6. Yeah, I was going to say there's different moves that black has. So this is an interesting game because It's a long game, which is often what you're going for with the Stonewall, and it's very even all the way through, and the advantage that black has at the very end is almost imperceptible, but Kramnick managed to convert this to a win. So I just want to step through the game. I'm not going to give it blow by blow, but you can see some of the things that happen. We see the two knights coming forward and occupying these good squares. That's excellent play. We see once again this bishop has been placed on the diagonal opposite the light-squared bishop, with the idea perhaps of pushing these pawns forward and trading off some pawns in the center. So all this represents good play from both sides. There's a little tempo on the queen there, but and then some trades. So these knights, this knight has disappeared, but the other one hops in there, and now black maneuvered his knight. Kramnick maneuvered his knight to trade off the other knight that showed up on d5, and after some more trades, notice that in each case white was always the one that was initiating the trade. Black puts pressure, and white, I guess, doesn't want to allow that knight to be traded off and have a pawn dragged forward, although sometimes that can be useful, but I guess in these games that we saw, white didn't feel like that was the right thing, so white ends up taking there, and the knight gets chased away. Let's keep going forward. All this seems pretty okay, and until we get to this structure. And now we see that maybe there's a little something for black here. I guess, what was the last minor piece trade? It was this trade here when the light-squared bishops came off. Yeah, well, the reason that black has a little something in this position and through the rest of the game is that he's got the dark-squared bishop, which is the same color that white has, and he can put pressure on this d-pawn. And that's actually a feature of the rest of the game. And after this trade, it's kind of a permanent feature. Maybe that was an unfortunate choice by white to trade queens. White could keep the queen on and just play a maneuvering game. And because this position looks very even at this point. But after the trade, now this pawn is fixed, so there's no hope of ever freeing it up. And it's under fire from the bishop, so it always has to be defended, which keeps this bishop kind of tied down. And after a very long endgame, Kramnick managed to trade rooks and invade with his king. His king runs all the way from over here to this side of the board, and he wins the game. So kind of an excellent example of a Kramnick squeeze. If you want to look at the game, I'll include descriptions or pointers to the games in the video, but that would take us pretty far afield from the Dutch defense. So basically I just wanted to show this setup up to here. This is your basic setup with the Stonewall, and the moves for black here are castles or b6, preparing bishop to b2. And as I said, the plans for white are to occupy the center, and it's a little bit difficult to break through. You have to be patient with both sides. Your temptation with white is you want to just smash those pawns which are in your way from getting to the enemy king, but you have to build up to it very cautiously. Okay, that concludes this video. In the next one, I want to talk about the Leningrad variation of the Dutch defense, and that is really the main line today. So stay tuned. I will see you then.